I'm known for being boring in the building, policy-wise. I'm not doing a lot of flaming stuff, but what I am doing are these very rational improvements. I've got a list of things there, exciting stuff such as insurance data security, of improving how our data is handled. I've got a bill to modernize our reemployment benefits to get people back in the workforce. So I ran on a very rational improvement, basically a quality manager running to be in state government.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Alaska State Senator James Kaufman, who represents the Abbott Loop and Hillside areas of Anchorage. Although in his teens and 20s, he was a guitar player and songwriter for several successful rock bands, James began earning real money as an aircraft mechanic in Houston, Texas. He quickly found himself taking on bigger and bigger management positions, which ultimately led him to transitioning to the oil and gas field, which is how he eventually ended up in Alaska working for BP. He was elected to the State House in 2020, where he served in the Republican minority, and then he was elected to the Senate in 2022, where he now serves in the bipartisan supermajority. We discuss all that and more. James Kaufman, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
So I think we'll just open with the probably most unusual and unexpected thing that you and I grew up in the same small town in Texas.
Yeah, isn't that something?
It is incredibly random and weird. Although we grew up not that far away from each other physically in terms of miles, Friendswood, Texas. You were actually in a different school district than me. And I think because of that, you and I probably had completely different life experiences in terms of what our school experiences were like.
I imagine so. And then there's age. I'm a little bit ahead of you.
What year did you graduate from high school?
77.
Okay, I graduated in 93. Did you leave Friendswood when you graduated in 77?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, because I actually moved to Friendswood in 79 when I was 4 years old.
Okay.
So I just missed you.
Yep.
I was in Pasadena from birth to 4.
Pasadena. for folks that don't know, that's not like Pasadena in California.
No. My dad's joke always was the air is greener in Pasadena.
It's an industrial corridor. The joke about the air is you can smell the money.
Oh yeah,
because the jobs that corridor along the Houston Ship Channel and the kind of the communities that live on adjacent to it.
But moving to Friendswood at age 4, I have virtually no memory of life prior to Friendswood. Were you born and raised in Friendswood?
No, actually, I was born on the East Coast, and my family moved to Texas soon after. And that was back in the mid-'60s. I was a little bitty kid, and I was being raised in Texas by Yankee parents, which caused an interesting accent. Hey, you all, let's take the dog to the park.
Because that's how your parents talked.
Yeah, they had a New Jersey brogue.
That's so interesting. I grew up with parents with the thickest Southern drawls ever and ended up without one. But I feel like you sound like you're from Texas.
Yeah, you may not realize it, but you have a touch of the South in your accent too.
Probably more when I talk to you than when I talk to others.
It could be. But yeah, other than my parents' influence on my accent, which it causes some people in the South say, you're not from here, where are you from? And people up north say, yeah. But anyway, I was just so baked into the South for my career in Texas, Louisiana, all along the Gulf Coast.
Why did your parents move to Texas?
Work, really. Just the economy Houston was a booming city back in the day. And I think it was opportunity and cold weather.
Where were they on the East Coast?
Coastal New Jersey, so just slushy, wet, cold weather. And my uncle actually lived way out in the sticks on a big reservoir. He was a gamekeeper way down in South Texas. And so that was kind of an attractor. So we went and for a while. I lived out on this big swampy reservoir with the flooded bottomland with the oak trees and all that kind of stuff.
What did your parents do?
My father was the Western Regional Sales Manager for a high-speed printing machine company. Pretty exciting stuff. But these were the printing machines that encoded products as they go down, like cans and jars. So if you ever look at those little serial numbers on the side, there's amazingly complex, precise machines that put those code numbers on as the products are whizzing by at an incredible rate of speed. So it was technical sales, but he had a quality management background. My mother and father actually met during World War II at the Curtiss-Wright engine and propeller plant. He was a quality manager. She was an inspector. And so they met at work. And so the Kaufman brand, if you will, is the quality management thing that goes all the way back to, that's how my mom and dad actually met. He was the quality manager at a war productions plant during World War II.
And she was the inspector.
Yeah. So she worked in the department.
Did she work when you were growing up?
Yes. Yeah. She always fit her work in around the family. And one of the few memories I have of the East Coast, it's funny. She worked at a motel. It was called the Brookside Inn or something like that. But what was funny, the place was occupied mostly by people that were following the horses on the horse racing circuit. So you had these kind of East Coast sort of mafia looking guys wearing pork pie hats and stuff sitting around the pool. And she used to take me to work with her. And so I ran around the hotel and I was like the mascot. And there was all these East Coast characters sitting around with their pork pie hats,
guys.
Smoking cigars and sitting around the swimming pool during the day, waiting to go to the track. It was an interesting environment. But
and how many siblings do you have?
Myself, one sister, and 3 brothers, but one's passed away.
And I met one of your brothers who lives in Alvin because he was up here.
Yep. Yeah. That's my closest brother. He's the one I'm in most contact with, and my sister lives down still in the Houston area, in Friendswood.
Wow.
Literally in Forest Bend. She still lives there.
Wow, in the same neighborhood. And I want to talk a little bit about that, and I'll just explain for our listeners that I went to the Friendswood School District, which was smaller than the school district that you went to. And again, we're separated. I moved to Friendswood as a small child after you'd already left. So there was definitely a difference in time. Friendswood is considered a suburb of Houston. However, when I first moved there was a lot of empty space between Houston and Friendswood. It was 25 miles away. You're just driving by fields. Now it's pretty much continuous city all the way out.
Yeah.
But it was different. And you and I have talked about this before. I went to what was basically an all-white school. You did not.
It was pretty much the biggest divisions in my high school back in the late 70s. They were more social than racial, and because it all blended in racially. But what you had the surfers, you had the jocks, you had the ag kids. You had these cultural groups that were just reflective of America then, and it wasn't so much racial. But it was.
What was your group?
I was in the rockers. There's a guitar sitting right here. I was in the long-haired kind of rock music kind of thing.
When did you start playing guitar?
Oh, in junior high school. I think, a beat-up old electric guitar was my first bed partner. I could remember when I was a kid in junior high school waking up with my guitar laying on top of me.
Was music a part of your family, or were you were the musician in the family?
I'm the one that had it most integrated in my life, where I actually played in bands and was playing in clubs and all that sort of stuff. Nobody else took it that far.
Were you doing that in high school? Were you playing in clubs?
Not quite in high school. Played some outdoor kind of things, but not clubs, just not being of age. But later, I had a number of bands that they didn't really go anywhere, but they were good enough and we were organized enough where I did get to you play in front of 1,000-something people, or you go to New Orleans and do a gig and then have that experience as just a musician playing in a town. And so it didn't make me any money, but it sure did enrich my life. And I got to do cool stuff, going to big recording studios where back then it was all on magnetic tape. So you had the big wide 24-track tape and that whole ritual of being in a recording studio. And I've gotten to hear my stuff on the radio, and I'm a writer. So I was always the main songwriter in all the bands that I was in. And I continue that to this day, just as if I'm sitting on a plane or something, I'll be on my phone.
Writing out a song?
I'm not texting. I got an idea and I'm sketching out a song.
You write the music and the words, or just the music?
Both. Yeah.
Both.
Yeah.
What was your style of music, if you were to say some bands that we would know of that were in the same ballpark of the kind of music you were making?
Probably be obscure, because the music that was happening at that time. So in the 70s, that's when the whole thing, remember when the Police and the Cars and Blondie and the Sex Pistols and all that, it was that revolution in music that was happening. And it was so refreshing because the music industry had gotten really bogged down in corporate AOR, album-oriented rock. And it just dominated the airwaves. And suddenly this fresh sound burst through that was reminiscent in some ways of the British invasion back in the 60s. As it was a wonderful, energetic time to be in music. And in Houston, suddenly these little original music clubs popped up, because previously all the clubs had been very oriented towards, you had to be a cover band, you had to style yourself after somebody and just copy rock. And so suddenly there were little clubs that were funky and rowdy, but their whole purpose was for the music scene to bring original songs, original material. And there was a number of different bands in Houston at that time that you'd go see them and follow them. And there were people that passed through that scene. They weren't part of it, but they passed through it, like Stevie Ray Vaughan. I'm not saying he was part of that, but that same club scene in Houston, people that are now super famous, Eric Johnson, his group, the Electromagnets and all that. And for those that don't know, Eric Johnson is just a fabulous guitar player that plays a jazz fusion sort of thing. So there were big names that passed through all that. And then there was also just the froth of all these really imaginative, energetic little bands that popped up. And anything from the like really hard punk kind of style, which I was never part of, all the way over to a soft, like new wave pop. Mm-hmm. And I would say that the stuff that I was involved in was a power trio, drums, bass, guitar, with a really good singer. We had a guy who had a voice that like an Irish tenor kind of voice, but he was a rockabilly kind of flavored. Picture a really hardcore rockabilly band is what the music style was.
Interesting. One thing I want to say for listeners, I think people don't understand sometimes how big Houston is. We have New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, and then Houston. And I know that over the decades, sometimes Houston has actually had more people than Chicago.
Yeah, it's neck and neck.
Yeah. So I think to the average American, I think there's a surprise sometimes that Houston has had more people than Chicago. And I don't think people think of us as in a Chicago-like city, but we are a huge city with tons of people. So like the fact is like you making it in the music industry there is a big deal. Getting gigs in Houston is a big deal. People have heard of Beyonce. Beyonce's from Houston. It is a music city.
Yeah. And like I said, I had the pleasure of being in my car with my radio on and hearing something that I wrote playing on the radio. And here's what's really funny is I was sitting in traffic listening to that in the same damn place that I was when I wrote the song, because I wrote the song. What I used to keep was a cassette recorder in my car under the seat of my car. And when I get stuck in traffic, if I had an idea, I just sketch it out on the tape recorder. And actually, I got to hear a song sitting in traffic in the same traffic jam that I had been when I wrote the thing. So
do you have that song? Do you have
all that? It was all on tape and things. So it's ephemera that's just.
Oh, I'm going to look for it, James. And if I find it, I'm putting it in.
You won't.
What's the name of the song?
That one was Talk to Me.
Okay. And what was the name of your band?
The Bounders. But there's none of that. You can look and look.
I'll look.
But what you'll find, there's other bands called the Bounders.
So I might find the wrong Bounders.
Yeah, there's some guys in Vegas that some old guys still playing under that name.
Was this like 1980?
Yeah, 80, 81.
Okay. I'll still look. Friendswood, we have FM 528. It's also known as NASA Road 1. I went to school with folks who worked at NASA. I assume that you grew up with folks who went to NASA. That's a big part of our childhoods.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the whole NASA influence. So when I was a kid, junior high school, there were astronauts' kids mixed in the names. Later, when I needed money and I was in high school, I was a short order cook. I worked at a pizza kind of Italian restaurant place, and I was one guy made the pizzas, and I did the burgers, the lasagna, everything else. And Deke Slayton, who was famous, or one of the early original astronauts, he used to come in there all the time. Yeah, the whole NASA mystique was all baked in. Mm-hmm. Interesting family connection. For myself, I worked at Grumman, which I was working, this was an after-school thing, vocational work. I was working in the Grumman shop where they had built part of the lunar module, the lunar lander. And some of the old guys that I worked with had been on that program. Now, what we were doing when I was there was making parts for the F-14. It became a subassembly shop after the Apollo program, and it got used for subassembly manufacturing for parts to go to New York for full assembly. I was making F-14 parts with old guys that had been on the lunar project, and they told me stories about what a tin can it was. If you slipped with a screwdriver, you'd poke right through it because the thing was built for 1/6 gravity, and it was not sturdy by any means.
That's so interesting. My grandparents lived in Clear Lake, and they lived across the street from Ellison Onizuka. He was one of the astronauts who died when the Challenger exploded. And I was probably like 10 years old, and I remember going to my grandma's house and watching out the window all the people bringing casserole dishes to that house like the week after he died. Mm-hmm. Do you remember where you were when the Challenger exploded?
Right now, I don't. I was still in the Houston area, as I recall. But what I do know is on the shuttle program, my sister, she's expert at sewing, she's really good, but she worked for a contractor to NASA. If you think of the inside of the shuttle or any other spacecraft, you see a lot of backpack type thing. Yeah, you can't put something on the shelf. You got to batten it down. So everything goes in a pouch with Velcro and all that. So that's the type of sewing that she's capable of, a technical seamstress, if you will. And so stuff on the shuttle, my sister actually had sewed.
Wow,
so later in life, I went with her to the museum that they have at NASA. And she's pointing at stuff that I sewed that.
Wow.
And she would take the Velcro and the Nomex fabric and all the special stuff that they use. Things have to be designed to be very low emissions for smell, because smells can really build up in space where you can't ventilate, right? And it's a very technical trade that she was in, very unique. And it's interesting to walk with her around the shuttle exhibits, and she can point to things that she was involved in.
So you worked at Grumman. How did you go from that and being in a band to working in the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, I guess that sounds crazy. Well, the fact that I worked building sub-assemblies as a kid, so some kids are stocking shelves in grocery stores or whatever, and I'm not knocking that, but I was working on F-14s. I had somehow maneuvered my way in there. And so I had mechanical skills. And so my entry into oil and gas was actually using my mechanical skills. And so I ended up working for a fabricator, again, using just my mechanical and technical ability.
Like building stuff?
More like machine repair. And so, I mean, I can take things apart. I've taken a lot of engines apart. I've worked as a mechanic and all that. So my mechanical ability is what got me into oil and gas for a service company. And I was only in it working as a craftsman for a little while, and I got promoted. And for whatever reason, I kept getting pulled up until I ended up being part of management at a service company.
In Houston.
In Houston. And then what I didn't realize is that there was a company representative from an oil company. Whenever his orders were in the company that I worked for, I would take care of whatever he needed. And it turned out that he had his eye on me. And when he retired, he recommended me for his position. And so then I got sucked up into an oil company. And being a kid that grew up a very lower middle class kind of life, suddenly getting sucked up into an oil company, I felt like the Enterprise had beamed me up because they hired me. They took me to Chicago where the headquarters was. They put me up in the Swiss hotel. So there's the doorman with the big fur coat and there's flowers in the room and all this kind of stuff. And I thought I'd just gone to heaven. And I just fell into that again, just mechanical ability along with a desire to try and read and absorb all the information that was available. So I progressed through that. Amoco, BP, they merged. I ended up in BP. And then I had an incredible career on multi-billion-dollar projects as a quality manager. Again, using the fact that I had worked with my hands, but I was also competent to go through all the technical materials and all of that, and to just help make the projects go well. I could work with crafts, or I could work with the technical people or management. And so I was a translator between those two groups to help make the work go well. And the career just went off. So I worked on massive offshore projects that we built for the Gulf of Mexico. I was the manager on an $8 billion refinery project, not the manager, but one of the managers on the project for a certain segment of the work. And then lastly, for the last part of my career, I came up to Alaska and I was the quality manager for BP on the slope. And so I was 5 years in that position.
What year was that you took the slope job?
Came to Alaska in 2011. So I stayed in that position until 2017, retired, about 5 years in the position. And I retired at that point. I was retiring a little bit early. I was not quite 60. And I just, if I don't retire now, I won't be able to say I retired a little early. So that's what I did. And just started getting involved in community projects and things on the hillside, some community patrol work. There was a lot of crime back then. We were having a real crime wave in Anchorage. And so I started doing some community patrol work and organized a chapter of the community patrol on the hillside, fire safety initiatives, working with the community councils.
Hey, I want to ask though, obviously I'm from Friendswood and I live in Alaska and I love Alaska, but it seems like you came up later than me. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I think a lot of people would do their 5 years on the slope, retire and head back down south. Why'd you stay in Alaska?
It just fits. I just love it. Every time I drive home when I'm in Anchorage, I live up on the hillside by Hilltop ski area. As I'm driving there, I'm pinch me. I get to live here.
Same, because we grew up in a place that is incredibly flat. We did not have mountains, and it is. In Juneau, I look at the mountains every day, and I'm like, oh my god.
I know. Yeah. When I was a kid, I loved geology, and I was a little rockhound geek kid, and the geology fascinated me. And I lived on a damn mud flat, is what it boiled down to. Mm-hmm. And you go down to the beach and the water's 85 degrees and muddy.
It's disgusting. Yeah. Going to Galveston,
let's not get too harsh on it.
It's brown water with tar and jellyfish and sharks and stingrays. Yeah. It's everything you wouldn't want at your beach experience. But hey, I don't know about you as kids. I loved it. I loved going to the beach.
Yeah, it was funky, but yeah, a unique experience. But that's that specific area. If you go further south along the Texas coast, the dunes get big, the sand gets nice, the water gets clear. Yeah, it really gets nice. But that particular area where we grew up is one of the less attractive mudflats to go swimming on.
It's my understanding a lot of it's because of the Mississippi. There's just so much silt and dirt just being washed into the...
That's what it is. So if you go along the Gulf Coast, so you go from Louisiana and you sweep all the way down where you're starting to go on the coastal bend, as they call it in Texas, down towards Mexico, the rainfall gradient goes from 50 inches of rain annually that's pouring out, and it just continues to trend down. You get 40 odd inches in Houston, down to 20, and the water quality gets better as you go down. But I used to love going surf fishing and all of that. That's fun. Back in the day, some places still you could drive out on the beach. So your car, your ice chest, all of that.
Oh, I remember all that.
Set up your rods and reels, and you're catching redfish or speckled trout.
It's so funny. It's just such an unusual place. You cannot see your hand in the water 2 inches in. Sometimes you can't see it. My dad used to always say, the fish can't see either. No, no one can see. Yeah. It is cloudy water.
There's days when the clear water comes in, especially in the fall.
So you got involved in the community stuff on the hillside, and when did you decide to run for office, and how'd that come about?
2020, there was some controversy with the then representative, and
Who was the representative of that?
Jennifer Johnston. And so there was some controversy, and there was rumors of a primary, and some folks started talking to me about running. I think in some case, just to try and get somebody
More conservative?
I guess just get a manager in there, because people didn't know me as not a hardcore anything other than a hardcore manager. I just like things that are managed well, and you can keep the noise level down and the productivity up, then that's good. And so they started talking to me. So I still am not sure how I decided to actually click that mouse and register and go do it. But I filed and I ran.
Did you win the Republican primary?
I won the Republican primary. It had a 2-to-1 ratio in the final count. Election night, it was 3-to-1, my favor. And then with some of the absentee voting, the ballots came in, ended up being 2-to-1. And then I went on to a general election race in 20, where Suzanne LaFrance popped up as a late emerging.
I remember that.
Yeah, she had her staffer, Adam Lees, in there as a placekeeper for the primary, and then did a swap out. So I ran against Suzanne, and it was a tough race. I was massively outspent. I was doing a startup first-timer campaign against somebody that had massive outside support. They were pouring the money in, out-of-state money, to try and flip the state house. And I just campaigned the heck out of it, and I guess I hit about 6,000 doors more in that for what was then District 28. So,
well, 6,000 doors, that's basically the district. You door knock the whole district.
Yeah, and you don't do every house. You're
likely voter.
You're using data and hitting important doors multiple times, and also for different purposes. So there's different reasons why you're going the door. So hit about 6,000 doors, and I've added to that. I then got elected in the House for a term.
When you talked about like them, lots of money flowing into the Suzanne LaFrance race because wanting to flip the House, but the House was a bipartisan led coalition.
Yeah.
You were in the Republican minority.
I use that term because that's the term that the organizations, it's a thing where some outside groups pick 10 states that they think they can wag the dog.
Yep.
And Alaska is notorious for being a small market that a small amount of money in
can go a long way.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so we get targeted by outside money, not necessarily for a certain strategic reason, but it's just part of the puzzle that different groups are trying to put together. So it's just a fact of life of living in a low population state.
What was your experience like in the House?
It was fascinating. It was unique because came in on the heels of COVID. And so the building was shut down, and there was plexiglass everywhere, and there was mask mandates and testing every 3 days. You had to get swabbed to come in the building, and all this rigor and drama around all of that. And I had already had COVID, and so I'd been there, done that, and wasn't really afraid of it. It was like, okay, if I get it again, big deal. I'll be sick for a little bit. But the building was empty. People didn't have access. So it was really a phenomenal time for a first timer. And now you've come into the heat of a very frothy, active session. Your freshman session was pretty wild. What came into was really the building was so quiet. You could read anything you wanted to read because nobody was these 15-minute meetings that we had. And
they weren't happening.
Yeah. For those that don't have this experience, we're often calendared in these 15-minute blocks for people that just come through and want to talk to us, advocacy for one thing or another. And there's none of that.
But even when we don't, I find that I can't read an article for 6 minutes without someone knocking on my door, without a phone ringing. It is so hard. So I'm jealous because it can be so incredibly difficult. It can be so incredibly difficult to respond in depth to an email without getting interrupted.
I know. Yeah, maintaining a train of thought. So it was a wonderful way, a wonderful soft start year. The 32nd, the first year of the 32nd was this kind of soft start way of getting familiar with the building, with the processes, procedures, the role. And still, we got things done. So I was in the minority, but did substantive work. Got my first bill, HB 187. It passed unanimously through both bodies.
What did that bill do?
That was a document reduction bill. Its nickname was Office Space because its purpose was to reduce unwanted, unneeded reports. That once you get things written into law that shall be a report, we needed to create a mechanism so that we could undo that if the report was no longer needed. And it was a bill that creates a mechanism. Every 2 years, the executive branch reviews all the publications that it's doing. It already maintains a list, so that's not new work. But then it just goes down and says, do we really need to keep doing this? It's just a bill that requires a 2-year cycle of looking at all of the publications that we do. And some of these they're printed, they're sent everywhere. It's a heavy burden of work, the intellectual property of creating the publication and then publishing it and shipping it around and then ultimately throwing it in a landfill when nobody reads it. So it just creates a 2-year cycle of looking at that to try and rationalize, do we still need to do this? So the nickname was Office Space because of the TPS reports.
And then you decided to run for the Senate? Or I guess it had to do with probably redistricting and open seat. Or talk about what happened there.
It was the whole mix. My term in the House was as the House rep for District 28, which is what Laddie Shaw has now, which South Anchorage down to Girdwood, although now the new district goes further.
All the way to Whittier.
Yeah. And with redistricting, the precinct that I live in was the only piece that got moved into what had been Josh Revak's district, pretty much. And it's pretty much that district with the addition of my precinct. So there I was, and Josh decided he was going to run for the House on the federal
U.S.
race.
House, yeah.
And so he decided that. And so I said, okay, if I'm going to run, I might as well go
Now's
big.
the time.
Now's the time. The only problem is I was starting all over again. I had another brand new district, and I went out and started knocking on doors again. And you almost feel like, dang, I banked up all that goodwill and name recognition.
They know who I am.
I've been emailing and doing all the stuff that you do with constituents and all that. And suddenly I'm just kind of getting moved north. But I did, and the race went well. I won by about 9-10 points or something. I don't recall exactly, but it all went well. A lot of people complain about campaigning. I like it, and I think that really helps. And I actually like doing doors. Now, sometimes it's hard to talk yourself into going up and getting out there. I imagine you're the same.
I do not enjoy campaigning. I sometimes feel like that I'm a bad politician if I admit that, but it is really hard for me to get myself out the door to go door knock. There's nothing. Getting myself to knock on that first door is like pulling teeth.
It's like taking a walk on a rainy day. Now, it's hard to get yourself out the door, but once you do, you go, you know what? This ain't so bad. And I have to say, having all those conversations, running a campaign, there's so much just administrative stuff, and there's all the intellectual side of it, the content and creation and all that. What I find is actually getting out, knocking on doors and all of that, it's grounding because you get pulled out of all that other stuff, and suddenly you're just in the moment of having conversations with people. And it can be fascinating. I've had an entire family come out and wrap around me in a group hug and start praying for me. And it makes you want to cry.
I agree with you. I've never regretted doing it. Even when I've had doors where people have yelled and screamed at me, for the most part, there's always been at least one or two really good conversations that happen. I think part of it for me is that I'm so new to politics. And I never had anyone knock on my door living in any other state. It was only in Alaska that people knocked on my door. And when a random stranger knocks on my door in Alaska, I hide. I pretend like I'm not home. I don't want to talk to the stranger because I had that sort of context about how much I didn't want to answer the door and talk to a stranger. I'm like, I feel like that's what I'm thrusting upon others.
Let's roll back a little bit. In the 2020 campaign, that was at the peak of the COVID kind of hysteria to some degree. And what was fascinating is that so many people were home. And so door knocking can be a delicate thing because you want to get there when people are there. You don't want to get there when they're having dinner, trying to feed the kids. So it's
impossible. I feel like it really is because, you can door knocking, you're going to door knock for a few hours. You're going to inconvenience somebody. You cannot make it perfect.
No, you can't. And yeah, nor should you try. You just try and do a decent job of it. During COVID, I would go out middle or 10 o'clock, and you find people sitting there with their laptop out in the front yard and working from home. I'm doing air quotes for those listening. And people were starved for contact. And so it turned out the silver lining of COVID and campaigning during it is that there was a large group of people that were just happy for human interaction.
They wanted to talk to you. But of course, then when you ran for the Senate, you started with a whole new district, basically. And you had to face the difficulties I had of people not being home or people really not wanting to talk to you.
They're or saying, wow, the other nice thing is the validation. Thank you. You're actually out doing the work and you're actually out to talk to me. There's people that get it and they appreciate it. And I think even some of the people that may be a little gruff with whatever's going on. I had an amazing thing happen. I knocked on a fellow's door and he just started raging at me. And I'll
let you go.
But sorry, I'm thinking you didn't have to answer the door. You could have just
hid like I used to do.
But he came out just, coming in hot. And so then I walked down the street, and this was an area with kind of big lots. And so I walked for a while, and I had gotten to the next house. Here comes the guy pulling up, screeching up in his car. And I think, oh God, he's coming to kill me. And he comes up, the window rolls down. He goes, I'm sorry. I said, thank you. Thanks for that. I said, but no worries. I said, no worries. He goes, no, I want to tell you I'm sorry. He says, I was just talking to my friend on the phone. He's an idiot. And he says, and on top of that, I've got stage 4 cancer and I'm dealing with some stuff. And that's where in this business, stuff politics gets emotional because you're dealing with things that healthcare providers, educators, people that really deal with the public in delicate situations. Another place where that happens is in politics. So sometimes people like me, an old hardcore mechanic, project manager, some people think of me as Spock, very logical and very predictable and methodical. This emotional side of you gets pulled into it that you didn't even know you had, but it gets awakened in this. And so that's where politics is. It's a fascinating experience to go through because it brings you places, puts you into situations, and draws things out of you that you just never anticipated. At least that's been my personal experience.
So you won. You got elected to the Senate, and you are part of the supermajority. Yeah. And looking back, and I don't want to go too far, but it seems like when you ran for the House, one of the things you were saying was that you weren't going to be part of a coalition, and then you got elected to the Senate, and you are. How did that evolution happen?
Actually, I didn't say that. What I said all along the way, and I can reproduce all the stuff, is that I was running against the status quo, which I just felt the state was not being well managed, that we were doing deficit spending. We were drawing out of savings. There was just a long list of improvements. And so I ran for my first race, not as any kind of ideologue. I ran as a manager. I basically just ran saying, I don't have all the answers now, but here's what I'm going to look at. And here's what I propose. And I actually had a checklist of all the things. That's why I know I'm very well grounded in what I'm saying, that I ran to just be a better manager. Now, my opponent just went into wild territory, accusing me that I was going to bankrupt Alaska with my wild ideas and my frivolous spending and all that stuff. That was the exact opposite of what I was saying. So what many people ended up thinking of me is what I was accused of by my opponent, who was not grounded in the truth. It was pretty much say anything in order to get there. And so some people remembered all of that, but what I actually said, I continued to do, which is I'm known for being boring in the building, policy-wise. I'm not doing a lot of flaming stuff, but what I am doing are these very rational improvements. I've got a list of things there, exciting stuff such as insurance data security, of improving how our data is handled. I've got a bill to modernize our reemployment benefits to get people back in the workforce. So I ran on a very rational improvement, basically a quality manager running to be in state government.
Can you talk about the difference between being, I know you were only in the House for 2 years, and you had an unusual COVID experience that first year, but can you talk about the difference in your experience of being a senator versus being a House member?
Yeah, interesting. You go from the House, which has 40 members, and I was in the minority. And so it was an 18-22.
So it's a big minority.
Yeah. And what that can generate is a tension because the majority can't just steamroll the minority. They've got to work with them to some extent. And so I went from that to in the Senate with the supermajority, which out of 20, I'm a member of a 17-strong caucus, which means there's not really a functional minority at all. The differences are many, majority, minority. You're not chairing any committees or you are chairing committees. So you're a member or you're chairing some of them, you're vice chair. And so you take on the responsibilities of managing a committee and all of that when you're it. And so there's a big difference there. As far as the mode of operating, the way I operated as a minority member in the House was to just try and look for opportunities to do rational things and cooperate with people to get that done. And that's why I did bills that went through unanimously. Everybody voted for them because you look for a good idea.
Common sense bills.
You develop it and you move it through. And so that's where I operated. And I got, I believe, a reputation for being rational and hardworking and willing to look at issues and try and come up with a decent solution. So then when I got in the Senate, I'd say the biggest thing is that when you take half the members, it doesn't have the interactions, it reduces it exponentially. Because if you take the interactions of 40 people compared to 20 people, that's not a linear equation. And so there's a big difference in the way you can operate in the Senate where it could be more collegial with just a few discussions. You can come to terms on something and a lot gets done in the Senate quietly as opposed to the frothier,
more boisterous, chaotic.
Yeah, more and I just think of that as it's a much more complex chemical equation over in the House because of the number of people and the 2-year election cycle. So it's that way by design. And then the Senate is, again, a very elegant design that we have in our political system. And it works well. On average, if you look at the policy that does make it through, most of it makes pretty good sense. And that which doesn't, usually it's because there's some surprises, things that weren't foreseen. And then,
we didn't talk about your family. Do you have any kids?
No kids.
No kids.
No.
And moving towards the end of the time, do you, I guess, we often ask if people want to recommend a book.
There's a book that I love, 7 Mysteries of Life. It's Guy Murchie. It's an old book, but it's interesting. He's just a very thoughtful guy it's an interesting book where he's just pondering life. Yeah. And the design behind the amazing universe that we live in and all that. It's just a neat book. It's been around for a long time. And I've never recommended it to anyone that didn't end up saying, that's really a beautiful
What's the name of the book again?
7 Mysteries.
7 Mysteries.
Yeah.
I think we'll have some listeners check it out. James Kaufman, thanks so much for being on the show today.
My pleasure, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you so much, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-465-4940.